Hello everyone and a very good evening. My name's Don Arleth and welcome to World News Tonight, coming to you live from Warsaw. A political crisis for Poland's political coalition. After a presidential election, polls are asking what's next for the government headed by Donald Tusk. It's no secret that President-elect Karol Nawrocki, a major political rival of the Civic Coalition, a vote of confidence is just around the corner, which could further shake up Polish politics. We'll have more on that in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Poland's president-elect poses a challenge for relations with Ukraine. U.S. Speaker of the House backs tough sanctions against Russia. And the Action Space Mission 4 to the International Space Station carrying a Polish astronaut has been rescheduled once again. The Polish government is in crisis just days after opposition figure Karol Nawrocki clinched the presidency. The spotlight now shifts to Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Next week, Poland's parliament will hold a critical vote of confidence that could determine the future of his government. Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Dahmen, reports.
On the same day that the right-wing Karol Nawrocki was confirmed as Poland's next president, a late-night address from the country's pro-EU centrist Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
The first test will be a vote of confidence, which I will ask the parliament for soon. I want everyone to see, including our opponents at home and abroad, that we are ready for this situation.
Announcing a vote of confidence in his government as the ruling coalition faces the fallout of its candidate Rafał Trzaskowski losing a dramatic presidential runoff.
I mean, the election of Karol Nawrocki, his win was a major warning sign for the coalition, for the government, which has been criticized for a lack of vision.
The ballot is set down for next Wednesday, June 11, with Tusk widely expected to retain the backing of his government partners and pick up a majority vote in the Polish parliament.
Oh, of course, he's very likely to win this vote. He will win this vote. There is no doubt about that. What he wants to signal is strength. He wants to project strength, that he has the support of the ruling coalition.
Since Tusk rose to power after the 2023 general election, his government has been in a paralysing cohabitation with outgoing President Andrzej Duda, an ally of the right-wing opposition Law and Justice Party. Duda has been using the presidential veto to stall the government's proposed reforms, a pattern which is expected to continue under Nawrocki. And ahead of a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, Tusk made his own expectations clear.
This vote of confidence is not an attempt to continue everything we have been doing, because we know after a year and a half that some things can be done better and faster. This should be a new beginning. It will be offensive, not defensive.
So what happens if things don't go to plan? According to the Polish constitution, a failed vote of confidence would first trigger the dismissal of Prime Minister Tusk before kicking off a potentially lengthy back and forth between the president and parliament to appoint his successor. If that doesn't work, a snap election would be called.
The coalition right now is standing in front of the most important answers for one of the most important questions. They had to rethink their strategy. They have to rethink what will happen and what they have to do not to lose the capital, which they got almost 2 years ago in 2023.
As the government scrambled to shore up that political capital, the Law and Justice Party is calling for so-called apolitical technical specialists to take over. At the same time, its Eurosceptic president-elect is basking in the glow of his win, with leaders sending their congratulations, including US President Donald Trump, who briefly met with Nawrocki last month. Nawrocki responding to Trump's message that Poland picked a winner by writing that a strong alliance with Washington is one of his top priorities. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also sent his regards to Nawrocki, who's hardened his tone on the war-torn country and ruled out its accession to NATO in the throes of the election campaign.
Poland is our big friend and strong neighbor, and we respect the voting and of course voting of Polish people, and my congratulations to the new president.
Karol Nawrocki's presidency, which officially starts in August, already driving politics, power and a dose of diplomacy to the fore. Aaron Darman, TVP World.
Is Europe in for a different relationship with Warsaw? After the last parliamentary elections in 2023, the government led by Donald Tusk has spent much of its efforts healing relations with Paris, Berlin and Brussels. Now, after the victory of Karol Nawrocki and a campaign filled with anti-German sentiment, could we see Polish-German relations deteriorate once again? Sasha Farbach has more.
Expect a rocky road ahead for Poland's relationship with its powerful neighbor Germany. After a period of warming ties under Prime Minister Donald Tusk, experts warn that the mood is shifting, and not for the better, with serious consequences looming for both Berlin and Brussels.
It's definitely a setback for the German, but also for other European governments, because there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in play when one looks at the election campaign in Poland. And there was also a lot of anti-Brussels sentiment at play. So it doesn't look like the incoming president is a big fan either of Germany nor of Europe or the European Union.
Anti-German sentiment has been a defining theme of Karol Nawrocki's campaign, shaped by his previous leadership at the Gdańsk Museum and the Institute of National Remembrance. Following the Law and Justice Party's tough stance, including the 2022 demand for 1.3 trillion euros in World War II reparations from Berlin, Nawrocki has made it clear he fully supports holding Germany accountable.
Yesterday, the butler and valet of the German state, Donald Tusk, once again bowed before the Chancellor of Germany and said, "I don't know on whose behalf, that the issue of reparations from Germany is settled. And I am telling you that it is not."
Karol Nawrocki's victory, recently endorsed by President Donald Trump, highlights growing ties between far-right movements, while Germany's AfD leans pro-Russian, in contrast to Poland's nationalist conservatives. Experts warn this win could energize far-right forces across Europe.
I think Nawrocki's victory will probably embolden the alternative for Germany, because it once again has shown that the Trumpist authoritarian populism is quite effective in supporting certain forces within European democracies, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but as we've seen also in Germany, France and other countries.
Just weeks ago, Chancellor Friedrich Merz's leadership raised hopes for warmer ties between Berlin and Warsaw. But disagreements over migration and Germany's tougher stance on Schengen borders have stoked anti-German sentiment in Poland. Experts now warn this shift could realign Poland's focus, pushing it toward a closer, more bilateral relationship with Trump's Washington.
If I look at the election campaign and to what extent the United States was here supporting Nawrocki, I think this is a precursor of what to expect. Donald Tusk, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, they traveled to Kiev to show their support for Ukraine, but also to be more independent from the United States. And I'm not sure that this would be possible with this president.
Though President-elect Karol Nawrocki holds limited powers with foreign policy under Prime Minister Donald Tusk's control, his election sets the stage for a difficult road ahead. At a critical time when Europe must stand united on Ukraine, NATO and other pressing issues, rising tensions between Warsaw and its neighbors risk deepening an already fragile landscape. Sasha Farbach, TVP World.
Now, despite Polish President-elect Karol Nawrocki hailing from the same political camp as current President Andrzej Duda, promises made during the campaign put Nawrocki at odds with the Law and Justice Party's strategic goals, such as Ukraine's accession into NATO. The incoming president has promised to block such a move, which has many wondering how he will react to Poland's security challenges. Zuzana Jurek reports.
Meeting of two Polish presidents. Though both outgoing President Andrzej Duda and incoming President Karol Nawrocki are supported by the right-wing Law and Justice opposition party, their views on security and defense appear to differ. One of the key questions is the continuity of Poland's Ukraine policy. During his campaign, Nawrocki began to stray from the staunch support of Ukraine's NATO aspirations of the Polish government, instead questioning their alignment with the country's national interests.
Ukraine joining NATO would mean that the entire North Atlantic alliance would be at war with the Russian Federation.
During the meeting of NATO's eastern flank allies in Vilnius on Monday, aimed at forging a common agenda ahead of the Hague summit, the heads of state underlined their ongoing support for Ukraine. This included the outgoing Polish president, who stressed that he hopes Nawrocki will continue the shared NATO stance.
I'm certain that he will carefully consider the international situation, the situation in Ukraine, and Polish-Ukrainian relations once he becomes president.
Experts highlight, however, that irrespective of Nawrocki's words, the Polish president's responsibilities, apart from being the head of the armed forces, are primarily representative.
He has the potential to create diplomatic incidents, but ultimately as president he doesn't have that much power over this area of policy. His powers are really important when it comes to vetoing legislation and perhaps appointing ambassadors, but he doesn't have formal power over foreign policy.
But while questions emerge regarding the Polish president's stance on Ukraine, the country is also set to continue grappling with its own defense challenges. This includes the build-up of the armed forces' capabilities, an ongoing issue that Polish army officials have been flagging continuously.
First of all is, of course, the air defense, improving of our missiles and rockets capabilities, and it's exactly about the HIMARS system.
Apart from the pressing needs of air defense systems and short-term capability gaps such as ammunitions, modernization of the armed forces and ensuring preparedness for modern warfare is said to be a hallmark issue.
We have to still develop some so-called enablers, like reconnaissance tools, like intelligence tools, like communication and command and control systems. So all the things which integrate our capabilities.
Autopilot, correct?
When it comes to command and control systems specifically, outgoing President Duda postulated in July 2024 that improving their effectiveness must take priority. As he takes office, the task of collaborating with the centrist government will now fall onto Nawrocki. Experts stress that though some components are already in place, much more is needed.
But very often it's more about buying some technologies which are very often also dual use, like new systems of communication, that is new secure installation and secure tools to spread information within armed forces.
But as experts highlight, not just for Poland, but for the entirety of the NATO alliance, these are pressing issues which will require decisive solutions.
This will be a decades-long understanding that, you know, the holiday from history is over, and now we're in an environment where this is, you know, the focus and the spending on security is long-term.
As leaders of the NATO alliance are set to meet in The Hague at the end of June, two key questions are on the agenda: Ukraine's presence at the summit and the reform of the alliance's armed forces. It is against this background that the new president of Poland prepares to take office. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
Crippling sanctions, the toughest against Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's what the United States Senate is working on as Russia continues to stall on a ceasefire after peace talks in Istanbul collapsed. The proposal is for steep secondary sanctions on countries trading energy with Russia. Pavel Chaskovsky has the latest on this development.
The momentum for imposing stiff US tariffs on Russia is mounting. Most recently, House Speaker Mike Johnson backed a bill to sanction Russia as strongly as the US can.
I'm honestly surprised and glad that Mike Johnson has said this. We don't know if Trump's administration will actually go ahead with this, or is this just like a pressure point?
Johnson's backing for the sanctions bill came right after failed peace talks in Istanbul.
Right now, we haven't seen any single fact that would prove that Russia is ready for peace.
And as it was the second unsuccessful attempt to secure a ceasefire, the US red line for tolerating Russia's stalling seems to be drawing near. A bill that would impose stiff sanctions on the Kremlin has already gathered bipartisan support from almost the entire Senate.
We have 82 United States senators co-sponsoring legislation that would impose bone-breaking sanctions not only on Russia, but those countries that buy Russian oil, gas, uranium, and other products.
Apart from Russia, such sanctions would mostly impact India and China, the biggest recipients of Russian oil. But several countries in the EU could be affected as well. Numerous European countries still rely on Russia for large amounts of liquefied gas, as well as pipeline gas and oil. Additionally, 5 EU countries operate nuclear reactors that run on Russian-made fuel. Nonetheless, the US bill has the backing of the EU leadership, which plans its own measures against Moscow.
The EU is preparing its 18th package of hard-biting sanctions, including lowering the crude oil price cap. These steps, taken together with US measures, would sharply increase the joint impact of our sanctions.
The sanctions bill, first proposed in April, is moving fast. Eventually, it will need to be signed by the US president, who just last week seemed reluctant to consider imposing any sanctions on Russia.
I think it's going to hurt the deal.
But with the subsequent peace talks not bringing a ceasefire any closer, Ukrainians are hoping that the US will finally turn the screw. Paweł Trzaskowski for TVP World.
We're just a few days away from the blastoff of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station. This mission, and especially one of its crew, will be of particular interest to people all over Poland. That's because Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski will be on board the second Pole ever to travel to outer space. Sonia Gata-Biszczan has been following the story, so let's go for a pre-flight checkup.
With his mission planned for June 10th, Polish astronaut Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski is all set to go to space.
I'm looking forward to this last moment where I'm going to hear 3, 2, 1.
During the Polish technological and scientific mission to the International Space Station, Uznański-Wiśniewski is expected to complete multiple experiments.
It's a milestone for Polish space industry and for Polish sector that kind of activities.
The experiments on board will explore biology, medicine and AI, to name a few. The space environment is vital to conducting some of these tests.
For example, how the brain behaves in microgravity, we have to check in microgravity. We don't have microgravity on Earth except those vomit comet planes.
But Uznański-Wiśniewski is not the first Pole to go into space, nor to conduct experiments there.
We collected very rich scientific material. We will take the results of those experiments with us.
In 1978, Polish General Mirosław Hermaszewski participated in the Soviet space program Interkosmos.
This spaceflight will remain deep in my memory for the rest of my life.
Uznański-Wiśniewski will head to space as part of the Axiom 4 mission, which also includes astronauts from the United States, India and Hungary. The mission is intended to last for 14 days and the crew will reach the International Space Station in SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gata-Biszczan.
And now to the world of sport. Polish tennis superstar Iga Świątek is continuing her rampage through Roland Garros, collecting her 26th win in a row at the French Open. After a little over an hour and a half, the defending champion came out on top against Ukraine's Elina Svitolina, setting Świątek up for a semifinal match against current world number 1 Belarusian tennis superstar Aryna Sabalenka. Franciszek Piles has more.
Iga Świątek is well on her way to winning her 4th consecutive French Open following her last bout with Ukraine's Svitolina. The Polish star won the first set of the match decisively, beating her opponent 6-1, only to seal the deal in the second set, which she won 7-5. With the quarterfinals behind her, Świątek's attention now turns to the next step of the competition, and potentially one of her toughest matches yet in this year's French Open. Her opponent, Belarusian Aryna Sabalenka, a longtime rival of Świątek, overcame China's Qinwen Zheng to reach the semi-finals. Sabalenka, the current WTA ranking #1 female tennis player in the world, dethroned Świątek from the top spot in October 2024, after the latter spent 125 weeks as the greatest there is. In just 2 days, Sabalenka and Świątek will face off, underlining the tight schedule of the competition which the Polish star spoke on last Sunday.
I think if we would have less tournaments, it would be much more fun for us. But tennis is pretty an exhausting sport because of the schedule that we have. So it's not easy to keep it fun, but but honestly, I love, just working on stuff, and I love practicing.
Given the context of the rivalry between the Pole and Belarusian, the upcoming semi-final battle on Thursday, June 5th, will be fought for more than just a shot at securing the Roland Garros title. It will be fought for honor, respect, and Iga Świątek's redemption. Franciszek Pilis, TVP World.
And now it's time to dig deeper into the stories of the week. European efforts to help Ukraine are in the spotlight. I'm now joined by Sir Robin Niblett, Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House. Hello, good evening, and thanks for joining us on World News.
Pleasure.
Yes, now first I'd like to start with the collapse of the Istanbul talks. Based on how far the two sides are apart from each other in various issues, what do you think is next there for the war in Ukraine?
Sadly, I think what's there next is continued fighting. I think from the Russian standpoint, there's a sense that over this summer they can make more gains. The one thing, obviously, they're keeping their eye on is the US Congress. Donald Trump can be a very unpredictable person to have in any negotiation, whether he's on your side or not. But to the extent that Donald Trump starts to withdraw his and his administration's interest in the negotiations, then the US Congress will step forward. And the US Congress has historically been much, much more anti-Russian than you would think from a Republican group that supports Donald Trump. In the last administration, they increased US sanctions on Russia during the first Trump administration, despite Donald Trump wanting to improve relations. So we could end up with a standoff not only diplomatically taking place between Ukraine and Russia, but a much more actually active US position to bring pressure on Russia. I'm not sure it'll change anything in Russia's position, but it will mean that the US will be more, if I can call it this way, on Ukraine's side.
Yes, popular belief is that Europe has already cut off the Russian spigot of energy supplies to Europe, but that is hardly the case. There are still many countries taking quite a significant amount of Russian energy supplies. If these sanctions do in fact eventually go through by the US Senate, where does that leave countries in Europe, and just how bad will the sanctions be? Will they actually be levied on friends and allies?
Look, if the US Congress is developing a bill on this, you can have a certain amount of confidence that it will be developed intelligently. It won't be something that is thrown out there as a kind of generic statement, a feel-good statement, as, if I may say, some of the Trump administration's trade policies have done. So the US Congress is very supportive of NATO. It wants to see NATO obviously spend more on its defense, but they're conscious that with the NATO summit upcoming, they need to have the US and Europe's allies, America's allies in Europe, on the same side. So while there might be some pressure put on those European governments that continue to import, in some cases, Russian pipeline oil, very few, but quite a large number of them, Russian gas, especially LNG, which has grown substantially since the sanctions were imposed. I think what you would see is exemptions made for those countries, and that the targets, which after all are China principally, and Iran, and to a certain extent also India, and other countries around the world that are buying large amounts of Russian oil, I think you will find exemptions provided for European allies.
And concerning China, I mean, we've seen how Donald Trump, had this trade war with China, and then they backed off quite a bit, and China really didn't come forward from a position of weakness. So if these sanctions do go through, how is China likely to react to them? I think we have some technical issues. I think we've lost our guest.
I can hear you back again now. I don't know if you can hear me. There was a slight wobble there for a second.
Yes, I was asking about the impact that this would have on China, and how do you think China would react?
Yeah, I got your question. Apologies for that. Look, I think China is in this for the long game. They know they cannot trust the Trump administration for any type of stable negotiation, so they will try to keep the minimal amount of damage on their own economy. The way to do that is to keep threatening and implementing damage on the US economy. But the idea that there's some big deal out there between the US and China that could be struck, I don't think they believe it's there. They've already experienced, briefly, 145% sanctions. The idea that might be 500% sanctions, at 145%, it doesn't make any difference. So I think China was readying itself for a long trade war with the Trump administration and will not be deflected if they do end up being the targets of these new congressional sanctions.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is coming to Europe and will likely not attend the Ukraine contact group meeting. The special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, has said that Ukraine's NATO accession is a legitimate concern for Moscow. And now Poland's president-elect has vowed to block the move should it ever take place. Last year at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., we heard that it's not a matter of if, but rather a matter of when Ukraine joins the NATO alliance. What are we likely to hear at this year's NATO summit as far as that is concerned?
Well, given the fact that I think NATO wants to make sure, European members of NATO and Canada want to make sure they do not have a worse relationship with Donald Trump at the end of this, I think the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership is going to be downplayed significantly. It is impossible to make a promise of NATO accession to a country if you're going to call into question America's extended guarantee, whether nuclear or conventional, over all members as a result of it. I'm afraid I take the view where I would be supportive, I am supportive of Ukraine being a member of NATO, but the when is going to be a long time in the future. And the effort in the near term is going to have to be made principally by European countries there to be able to provide real meaningful military support to Ukraine with some quiet backup by the United States. That is much more important, in my opinion, right now than posturing on long-term NATO membership, which after all is not going to help Ukraine in the near term. So if I think that, and I am extremely supportive of Ukraine and of NATO, you can imagine the Trump administration thinks this in spades.
Final question relating to the Polish elections. I mean, here we saw President-elect Karol Nawrocki having a very MAGA-like campaign. Do you believe that these types of attitudes and movements are growing here in Central and Eastern Europe as opposed to other places in Europe? And are Central Europeans more susceptible to such rhetoric?
Well, it's a very big and complicated question. To make a few comments on it. The first thing I would say is that, look, Central and European countries only truly recovered their sovereignty at the end of the Cold War, which is a lot more recent than most European countries who recovered it in 1945. So there is, the end of the Cold War was about recovery of sovereignty, not about burying it in a form of European integration that limits sovereignty. So I think there is a natural instinct across most Central European countries to be skeptical about deeper forms of European integration. With Britain now outside the EU, the pushers of European integration tend to be associated with Germany and France. France is often unpopular because it supports European integration at one level, but loves to keep a lot of sovereignty for itself on the other. And of course, Germany is a country whose strength is always seen somewhat suspiciously, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and especially in parts of the Polish political establishment, not least your new president-elect. So I think that it is inevitable that countries in Central Eastern Europe are going to be more skeptical about European integration. But whether they become sort of far right in the MAGA sense, this doesn't necessarily have to be connected because in the end, most Central East European countries are doing very well out of European regional funds, cohesion funds, post-pandemic funds. and money in the end is also incredibly important to far-right or center-right political actors in Central Eastern Europe. So I think, the Poland first language plays to that, instinct about wanting to have greater sovereignty, but I do not think it's going to translate into a sort of collapse of the European Union or any efforts to pull back from it or being pro-US on trade negotiations.
Well, campaign rhetoric, they have to win a campaign, so we'll see how it translates into action. Sir Robin Niblett, always great to have you as Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House. Thanks for the conversation.
My pleasure. Bye.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.